into some of the emerging trends and topics that are facing the transition, the great transition, regionally in the Middle East, but also globally. And this week, we're going to look at the emergence of hydrogen hubs to watch in 2021. But before we dig into that subject, I want to introduce each of our panelists and invite them to select one of the news stories from the digest that has grabbed their attention. So why don't I kick off this afternoon with Molly Life, Principal Consultant in Hydrogen and Energy Transition from the Environmental Resources Management. Molly, welcome to the webinar, and I invite you to select one of the stories and why you've chosen it.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone. So I think several of the stories demonstrate the increasing linking together of hydrogen projects and underline the importance of the whole value chain in ensuring a successful individual project, but then also the development of hydrogen hubs, which will be key to bringing down costs and then ensuring that we have a successful commodities market that links together globally. So there are a number of stories which underlined that as an important driver. So it'd be interesting to drill down into those with the panel as we continue through the conversation.
And which particular story would you pick from that list to sort of dig into, as you say?
Yeah, so we can see, for example, between Russia and KSA, increasing ties. We're also seeing that matched across other regions. So, for example, Japan has a significant hydrogen import strategy from which it will need to develop solutions from the Middle East as well as other regions. And it has increasing ties with Brunei, for example, in order to do that. We're seeing similarly increasing, the word has gone out of my head, ambitions underlying the European hydrogen strategy. And
from that point of view on ambition, do you think, I mean, here in the Middle East, there's clearly a lot of very overt ambition, and nearly a sort of a panic that there is some kind of first mover advantage to grab a hold of. Do you think, Molly, that in Asia or in Europe that is comparable, or are we sort of a standout in that sense?
No, absolutely. I think that is very cognizant, particularly in the minds of policymakers in Europe, who are keen not to have some of the same issues take place which took place with the pure play renewables industry, where a lot of that manufacturing capability and the advantages associated with large scale rollout have gone to players outside of Europe. So I think policymakers are keen to do things a little bit differently in terms of the hydrogen opportunity to ensure that those advantages are captured, and the early stage investment in projects through research funding, through grant funding for early stage projects, and eventually through revenue support is realized through jobs and wider economic benefits. So absolutely, Sean, yeah.
Let's welcome our second guest speaker, Suhail Shatila, a Senior Energy Specialist, Strategy, Energy, Economics and Sustainability at Apicorp. Suhail, welcome to the podcast. I would invite you to select one of the stories on the digest and give us your reasons why you have selected that story.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for this opportunity and for having me today. Well, several topics caught my attention in this list, but for the MENA region and with the recent advancements in the green hydrogen and the blue hydrogen projects that are being announced, I would select the obstacles to a hydrogen revolution. And I would like to talk about it from a MENA perspective and how MENA might emerge as a hub for exporting hydrogen. You know, several MENA countries are setting hydrogen policies and roadmaps, but this is only the starting point. And many pieces of the puzzle need to come together in terms of required infrastructure, R&D, regulatory framework, funding and financing, So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed. Currently, gray hydrogen mainly dominates the relatively small hydrogen market in the MENA region, which is mostly dedicated to refining and feedstock for petchem projects. The transition to other colors or low carbon hydrogen, I would say, like blue hydrogen, or zero carbon, like green hydrogen, this was necessitate structural changes in the green hydrogen or the blue hydrogen economy, since the new technological components will be added to the value chains.
Molly, on that point, do you see any sort of global obstacle that is that's sort of the sort of if you like the cold breeze that is to blow away a lot of this sort of optimism and ambition we're seeing at the moment, that isn't necessarily unique to the Middle East, but ultimately globally, big obstacle, capital access to finance, for example?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment around, is hydrogen overhyped, and is there going to be a massive, pop in that bubble at some point? Because we need significant cost reductions, which will only come with significant scale up. There are also a number of technical issues which need to be overcome, as well as the removal of regulatory barriers and building of the health and safety case and public acceptance, particularly if hydrogen is going to be used in applications in domestic settings. So I think there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome in this market, but we're seeing an enormous amount of ambition, and particularly over the last year or two, the building in of hydrogen as a critical part of national and regional strategies to achieve net zero, and a recognition of the potential economic advantage. So I think personally I have quite an optimistic perspective. I feel that there are real challenges, but I can see that those will be overcome, and I would expect that we will see an increasing acceleration of at-scale rollout, which will then, through learning rates, etc., bring down costs. And by the early 2030s, I think we'll see the linking together of markets on a much larger scale, as we see large-scale rollout of green hydrogen in regions which don't have a significant domestic demand. So, yeah. So I understand your question, Sean, and I think there are quite a few people who would reflect that sentiment. But I probably have quite an optimistic perspective about that.
Well, let's introduce our third guest, Andrew Clennett, co-founder and CEO of Haringa Energy. Andrew, welcome to the table. I'd invite you to select one of the stories in the digest for your news review.
Yeah, I think I'd probably choose two that relate, I think. So if we're looking at one of the topics I think of importance is the type of hydrogen. So I think the focus, I really would like to focus on green hydrogen, how you get to it. And so the green hydrogen reaching cost competitiveness that Molly just touched on, what's the pathway for that? But I think there's another thing that we've got to be very wary of, the hype that happens around hydrogen. And so, for example, one thing that started to come in is the waste to hydrogen story. Now, waste to hydrogen managed well can be a great story, but we've got to really be clear about what's happening to the carbon side of that waste cycle. So we've got to be very careful with, if you get waste to hydrogen plants that emit what is effectively in plastic a sequestered carbon and emit that carbon out there, we're actually not achieving it. So that is in a way not really anywhere near that green hydrogen molecule we're looking to achieve. But if we look at the scale of the concept that Australia talks about and the scale of achieving competitive green hydrogen and commercial green hydrogen, that's actually, I think, a very important step. And look, it is very close. It's understanding those early use case markets, the sort of decade that Molly talks about, where by the end of the decade, we do believe optimistically we've achieved that full scale for hydrogen applications across many sectors, but there are already cases now where green hydrogen can have a big part to play. So I think it's very important to understand that where we achieve these hubs, and it's the theme of today's discussions, where we start to achieve these hubs, we can already have green hydrogen competitive. And so
as we say, the idea of the story that you've focused in on, the reaching cost competitiveness. I mean, there is a sense at the moment in this hype bubble that we're in, coming out or coming through COVID. It seems these two things have come at the same time. There's a certain narrative that the world is in an economic rebounce rather than a recovery, and in some ways that idea of rebounds, where you sort of throw the ball against the wall and it bounces inevitably off the wall quite with a lot of velocity for the first 2 or 3 meters, but then drops off quite quickly thereafter. And taking that metaphor and taking it to hydrogen, do you think it applies that this moment of time, the ball is bouncing with great velocity off the wall, but it could drop fast, and then what needs to come in very quickly to keep that velocity up?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of people that can spell hydrogen, so
Right.
so you do get
H2.
this sort of, yeah, you do get this sort of hype cycle going on. But one of the things that I think we can peel back well beyond that, and companies like ourselves and others, we've been at this well before COVID, and it's something that we've identified where those commercial cases are, and it's focusing on and executing that. It's great that there's the popularity here. I mean, there were companies out there, and a lot of the companies that are creating these really commercial business models. They existed before COVID. COVID's in some ways delayed things, and in some ways maybe it reinvigorated, if you like, the capital markets, or reinvigorated the governments and maybe some of the other investors and so on. So really, I think it's a longer play. The trend has definitely been impacted by the COVID and the bounce back, and the conversation is up front and center. But the companies that are really out there making a difference, in the countries and the strategy and the policies, they were being worked on well before the COVID world. And it's
Hale, if I just bring you in on that, and the story that Andrew's picked up on cost competitiveness, the economic viability of such massive, I mean, for a long time, hydrogen has been sitting ignored in the corner, ultimately because of this reason being that it was so uncost competitive. Does this window of time, has it suddenly changed the cost competitiveness of hydrogen?
Sean, I think with the current energy transition trend and the need to decarbonize and to electrify economies with low carbon or zero carbon energy sources, hydrogen will play a vital role in that transition. It's a versatile energy vector. It's an energy carrier, and it is abundant, but still the cost of extraction and transportation is expensive compared to fossil fuels.
Is the moment in which we're seeing a lot of government stimulus, and Europe being a sort of case in point, where a lot of public funds are being made available at free to nothing, to cheap, to whatever way you want to put that. Is that a unique moment that is making this economic viability possible?
Yeah, definitely. If we're talking about the MENA region, having competitive advantage in low-cost renewable electricity and low-cost natural gas, so green hydrogen and blue hydrogen could be produced at low cost compared to other hubs. I think, with the acceleration of energy
but
transition,
just on that point alone, the subsidy point, the idea that Europe is putting forward up to €1 trillion, a big portion of which is being designated for the transition. My question ultimately is quite specific. Is that this unique moment that is making this potential cost competitive, which it wasn't only a very short time ago, try to identify very quickly what has changed. And that's the only big change I can see, is all of this available capital from governments to stimulate the recovery of their economies.
Yeah, definitely. That's one side of the issue for the MENA economies. But again, other side is to be the first runner or the first movers into the hydrogen economy. I mean, the GCC countries, if you want, will be in competition with Australia to supply southern eastern countries such as Japan and South Korea. So the first movers will have a competitive advantage and to take more market share, as Japan and South Korea, for example, are shifting from coal to greener energy sources for power generation. North African countries, for example, have a competitive advantage to supply Europe through hydrogen pipelines. Your question about financing, of course, the business model, the emerging business model in the MENA region is currently centered on clustering the hydrogen production facilities and using or utilizing common infrastructure to push down the cost, and mostly all of the projects are underwritten by government investments.
Well, I can see that here, and you're making that sort of turn in the road to the sort of topic of the day, which is obviously good. And let's do that, Molly, and let's maybe kick off with a bit more kind of ABC basic from your perspective. What are the ingredients of a hydrogen hub? What needs to be in the bucket to kind of put your hand up and say, hey, we qualify?
Yeah, yeah, I just want to say as well, I think Sahil made a number of really important points there, which were really interesting. So yeah, what's important about hydrogen hub? So I think for me, the key thing, which is a little bit glossed over at the moment, there seems to be a rush for hydrogen production, and a lot of countries really focused on hydrogen production for domestic use and also export. But in order to have success, it's key to have your production, your transport, and your use all linked together. And I think a successful hydrogen hub needs to have anchor demand as part of it. And there's an important role for governments in terms of mandating that, which might be pricing externalities associated with other fuel types to make hydrogen cost competitive. It might be mandating the blending or the use or the decarbonisation of particular industries. There's a number of different routes that governments can take in order to promote demand creation. But
and on that point, Molly, would a hub candidate look different for a green hydrogen hub versus a grey one?
Yeah, certainly, because obviously the production side will be completely different. But when you're thinking about transportation and storage, you can use the same infrastructure, and depending the extent, so depending which off-takers you're using and what the form of hydrogen they're taking. Are they taking ammonia? Are they interested in hydrogen? You'll need different storage and transportation infrastructure, and there will be different requirements around health and safety and different potential to repurpose existing infrastructure in order to achieve that. If it's a hub that's focused primarily on hydrogen production for export, then the storage and the export capabilities will be key. So that will include large-scale conversion facilities to liquid organic hydrogen carriers or ammonia, which could be very energy intensive. So the cost of electricity will be another key ingredient in the case of that type of hydrogen hub. So there's a lot of kind of variables which will enable you to optimize the business case. There might be potential to repurpose heat from industrial users for the conversion or deconversion process to liquid organic hydrogen carriers. there might be potential to link up with off-takers who are taking methanol or ammonia, in which case you can use those as your storage and transportation vectors and reduce costs.
On that point, Andrew, that Molly mentions there about the need for a domestic market, or at least certainly an advantage, I think a lot about LNG and the early days of LNG, liquefied natural gas, the huge amount of capital and investment into the infrastructure, of which that wasn't, that is not present. And I know the Middle East has competed a lot with Australia in that space and still does. But your thoughts on that, the need for a domestic market in order to create a hub?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And to be honest, Molly was right on the money there in identifying those elements, that sort of production, the transport, and the offtake. But that's the beauty of hubs, is potentially you can shortcut some of those more difficult elements. And so if you can identify, say, a domestic market that does not require transport of the hydrogen, if you can identify that, if you can have your production at that point, and if you can have your renewable energy and renewable electricity generation co-located there, I've shortcutted a lot of those costs that make hydrogen more expensive. So that's what we certainly focus in our company on, those sort of, where can I get all my stars aligning, my domestic offtake. And then it's not just offtake, what are my offtakes? So if I've got a domestic chemical offtake, so ammonia production, that do I balance that with, say, a transport market? So transport, hydrogen for transport is competing with a liquid fuel, so it can demand a slightly higher price point. Into industrial chemicals, it's sort of that medium price point, and obviously if I'm just going to burn the molecule, it's a lower price point. So understanding those domestic market offtakes.
And does Australia think it has all those pieces? I mean, you would, like a lot of things Australia does, you've got your big customer China on your doorstep.
Yeah, I think that it is one of the nuances. I'm an Australian that's actually developed a business in New Zealand as well. And the difference that we see here, Australia started thinking export. What does Australia do well? They export LNG. So that's where they first started the hydrogen approach. Realized quite quickly, that A, that market doesn't exist, and B, it's a low, it demands a very low price if it does exist. So it does need that mega scale to already happen. And we know the technology has still got a path to play. They're shifting their focus, and some of the work that we've been doing in New Zealand, we can really create those hubs. So we're building a wind farm right next to an ammonia plant with trucks that turn up and fill. I mean, we've got that hub happening. We're doing that in a few places, and we're looking at that in Australia, and others are looking at that in Australia. So you do have those ingredients, and there are many countries of this world that do have that. I mean, Middle East, no doubt, has got similar ingredients to create those hubs.
So, hell, I mean, we have some of the ingredients, but when I listen to Andrew there, I get a little concerned. They seem to have a lot that we do not yet have. We have certainly ambition and capital.
Yeah, I think the Middle East currently doesn't have a domestic market, very small domestic market. The strategies which are being built right now for at the governmental levels, or NOCs that are shifting towards blue hydrogen, are mainly focused on export markets, basically. So we can see projects in UAE with ADNOC announcing 1 million ton per annum blue ammonia for export. We have the Air Products with Aqua Power collaborating to produce 1.2 million ton per annum in NEOM in Saudi Arabia from 4 gigawatts of renewable electricity, and to be shipped by green ammonia ships. So the focus right now, until we have a domestic market, the focus will be on export markets. And for the GCC, it will be the Southeast Asian countries. For the North African countries, if they move into the hydrogen race, such as Morocco and Egypt, they have a competitive advantage to connect to Europe via hydrogen pipelines. Even they might not need ammonia ships.
So, Hale, you said earlier about the importance, or maybe I misunderstood you, but ultimately that the need for cooperation, the opportunity to leverage infrastructure and share infrastructure. It's not something we've done very well in the Gulf. I'm wondering your thoughts on how big an obstacle that may be for this region if everybody wants a kind of like, I want my own airline sort of thing, and we do not sort of choreograph that cooperative approach?
Yeah, unfortunately, that has been an issue. Even if you look at the electricity markets and the power trade among the MENA countries, the same analogy could be translated into the hydrogen and the gas markets. Unfortunately, each country is planning to be the first mover, is to claim more market share. But of course, having more further collaboration between countries, it will drop down the cost of export and make the region as a whole as a competitive export hub to the rest of the world.
Molly, you mentioned there about the domestic market for a hub to coexist. Ultimately, what is the role of the partnership? I mean, again, back to the LNG analogy, the way LNG got off the ground was ultimately you got a customer who locked in a 25-year contract, put multiple billions of dollars up front, and that very expensive infrastructure was built because it was partnerships rather than a standalone. I wonder how important is that model on this occasion for the sort of emergence of, if you like, from an LNG point of view, a Qatar of LNG, which is the world's biggest, at least it was.
Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, so transport, if you're not using your hydrogen domestically, then transport can effectively add on a very similar amount to the cost as the original production cost. So it's a significant amount, and it can effectively double the price of hydrogen compared to domestically. So that can make it difficult to compete. So, you know, producing hydrogen for export is I think it's of value where you have an example like this, where there's very limited domestic demand and you can produce hydrogen very cheaply because you have very low cost of production, because you have excellent renewables resource. And also there's the potential for blue hydrogen as well from fossil fuel resources. So, that's an important point to me. In terms of long-term contracts, I think it depends a little bit on how this market develops at the moment and what the financing structure behind the projects is. For projects where there's significant government support and it's more of a demonstrator early stage project, and there are likely to be a significant amount of demand but not sufficient supply yet, I think it will be less of an issue. But as this market matures and as we have at scale transportation, as a global commodities market develops, it will become obviously the dynamics will shift quite a bit. At the moment in the UK, the government is looking at sort of long-term revenue support for hydrogen production in a similar way to a kind of the feed-in tariff that we saw for pure play renewables. So there'll be a sort of auction system which will then have a kind of cap and floor around the production the value that the producer will get. So that's a way of de-risking, the hydrogen production process and making it more attractive to developers. But obviously, long-term offtake solutions are another one. But I think it's unlikely, at least in the early stages of the market, that suppliers would accept that, because they can see, like everyone else, the cost curves that are expected for this commodity. And when we look at green hydrogen, the prices of electrolyzers are expected to fall by 50% by mid-decade. And
you could have a bit like the first mobile phone you bought, it was this size and cost this much. But Andrew, just coming back to the sort of key question of a hub, of a hydrogen hub, and clearly Australia puts its hand up very firmly for many different reasons you articulated. Is this a case of where first mover advantage is important? Is there an opportunity for multiple hubs? And from that point of view, is it worth doing something really expensive, even if the economics don't make sense, to claim first mover advantage?
Yeah, good question. And look, I honestly think we've got to take the step back and look at what we're actually competing with. We're competing with decarbonising the planet, and so with fossil fuels is a competition, to be frank. And so the scale of the fossil fuel economy is just enormous, and the task that we have is just enormous. So yes, there'll be some early opportunities to capture market, but it's a very early limited market, and that market will not be the same as we go through time because of the cost down. So you're only as good as your last project on this one. So I think that the fear that says that we need to establish ourselves now and claim that early mover advantage, I think has a very limited time frame. Now, don't get me wrong, it's about how you accelerate through this early stage. So if you're looking at a refueling network, clearly we don't want to have parallel refueling networks in any country where you're sitting there and you've got two choices when there's only one truck, so you've got to manage that. There's a little bit of early mover there from that sense, but to be honest, early mover should be about you're really good at producing a cheap molecule. And there should then be someone else that's come up with a clever way to produce an even cheaper molecule. So I think early mover advantage should be focused on the damn cheapest molecule we can achieve. And that will unlock the market. Our competition is diesel, petrol, industrial chemicals derived from fossil fuels.
Well, Suhail, that is both, I suppose, an advantage for us here in the sense that we have some of the components for that cheap molecule, but we also have the components for an incredibly cheap fossil fuel molecule, ultimately, with great incentive to keep digging it out of the ground and sending it elsewhere. What is our advantages focusing on the hydrogen molecule that will, do you think, allow the Middle East to put its flag firmly in the ground as a hydrogen hub?
Yeah, definitely. The MENA region has a competitive advantage in producing very low-cost renewable energy. We saw tenders reaching 1 cent per kilowatt hour in solar PV. But however, for green hydrogen...
And that's ultimately underpinned, if I understand it correctly, by obviously the availability of sun, but also the availability of land at next to essentially free prices.
Yeah, definitely. But another piece of the puzzle that should be looked at is that scalability of renewables is needed. With scalability comes energy storage solutions that need to be integrated into the network in order to flatten the dot curve. And until that scalability is reached, then you can scale green hydrogen production facilities and become cost competitive. When looking also at green hydrogen, as Molly rightfully said, electrolyzers are still very expensive. Are still small modules. We don't have big modules to install multi-hundred scale of electrolyzers. Alkaline electrolyzers are dominating the market. PEM are more expensive. We have the solid oxide electrolyzers under R&D. So still, electrolyzer, this is a technology risk, basically, that needs R&D and needs a budget until that cost curve drops down. So the MENA region has a competitive advantage in covering or having that cheap electricity, but electrolyzer technology need to complement that piece of the picture. For blue hydrogen, also the MENA region has very low cost natural gas and the big resource base of natural gas. However, again, the same analogy, we have to look at the CCUS technology, which is still not mature technology. It's still developing and adds a lot to the cost of producing blue hydrogen. However, the MENA region has a competitive advantage that it has access to depleted oil and gas reserves where they can store CO2 or reuse them for petchem and refining facilities.
Yeah, that's a whole area is an underground storage as well for gas, which is something that we don't do enough of here. We need to just shift to our final sort of quick fast fire outlook for over the hill, beyond the horizon crystal ball. Molly, what are we not seeing that you're seeing because you're deep in the weeds of this every day? What's over the horizon you think that's going to kind of come quicker than we expect and maybe change the paradigm?
What's going to come quicker?
Another COVID pandemic?
Yeah. Oh dear, no. Yeah.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, I think so. We've you know, we've got fully funded research projects seeking to breach some of the technical gaps, to bring costs down in key equipment items, as Sahil mentioned, you know, electrolyzers, and also CCUS, and improve CCUS technology so that it can capture a greater proportion of carbon emissions and bring blue hydrogen closer to net zero. So I think that kind of fully funded research program in you know, several countries and regions gives me confidence that we're going to see these technological improvements quicker than we expect, and that will then feed into the scaling of electrolyzers, cost reductions, improvements of performance, and all of that helps to bring down costs more quickly than expected.
Andrew, your thoughts over the horizon. You know, Joe Biden, I think, is surprising a lot of people with the veracity of his commitment to the climate challenge, and bringing America back into this corridor can only be full of great accelerators forward.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, I really would double down on Molly's points that the pace of change of the cost downs is really quite dramatic, what we've seen in the time that we've been in the business. And actually to get the scale that gets the cost down, it doesn't need to be as big as people think. You know, it just needs to have enough scale to have commerciality and help, you know, an electrolyzer go from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt to 10 megawatt. There's huge cost downs early. It's not, you don't need the 100 megawatt gigawatt scale to have achieved the cost down. 80% of cost down in technology occurs in the first 20% of your activities. We've got to recognize that. So we're seeing that in definitely in electrolysis, but also in the use case technology that drives that domestic market. So from 15% year-on-year minimum cost downs in the vehicles, in these heavy vehicles and so on. And that when we are only 3-4 years from diesel parity on a fuel cell truck. I mean, that's, if you think about it, in the whole scheme of things, diesel had 150 years to get where it is, and we're going to achieve this parity within half a decade. So look, I think that's the pace of people haven't quite contemplated. You don't need the scale you think you need. You just need this commitment for these hub projects, for these early projects, and the cost downs will be rapid.
Suhail, you're kind of over the horizon crystal ball. We've seen in the last week alone some very significant changes in the international oil companies, the oil majors as they're called, being forced into change, some changing, trying to stay ahead of the curve. Total Energy now renaming itself. A year ago, you would have bet your house none of this would have happened.
Yes, definitely, Sean. Actually, today, the International Energy Agency published its World Energy Investment document. And a very important statement was mentioned in that document when it talks about hydrogen. It says that the expectations for the near-term expansion of low-carbon hydrogen are higher than ever. This is a very important statement because it's sending the message that not only green hydrogen will be used for net zero targets. It opens the doors for blue hydrogen, for nuclear power even to play a role, yellow hydrogen they call it. So it widens the spectrum of options, and of course the IOCs and the NOCs will be much more interested in blue hydrogen than green hydrogen because it's much closer to their existing business models.
Well, we must wrap it up there. It is a subject that will go on and on inevitably. But that culminates this week's Energy Transition Dialogues. I'd like to thank very much Molly, Suhail, and Andrew for joining us on this week's Dialogues. And we look forward to welcoming you back again, where I'm sure the next time we engage, there might be even leaps forward that we're not seeing right now. But thank you very much for being on this week's webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, guys.